everybody for coming back. I'm sorry we are experiencing some technical difficulties. So we are able to see, Michael, he is not able to see us, which was the initial plan. And we were going to live stream, but we're now going to record and make the recording available to interested parties. My name is Julie Gilson. I'm based here in the University of Birmingham's Politics and International Studies Department with Tsering. Tsering asked me to chair this session for our keynote speaker and to moderate any questions and answers. As someone from the Politics Department, no one in my department would need an introduction for Professor Michael Green. I think he's on most of our reading lists, and we're very familiar with his work. But in case anybody should need to know, Michael is currently Professor and CEO of the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, where he's been for 3 years. He's just told me. On leave, I don't know how you wangled that, but it's amazing. On leave from Georgetown University, where he's the chair of the Modern and Contemporary Japanese and Politics and Foreign Policy Group. Previously, in a very illustrious career with lots of things I could spend a long time talking about, he's been, for example, Senior Vice President for Asia at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, Special Assistant to the President, and Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council. Publications are numerous. I've just thanked him for a 2022 book entitled Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzo. And I've also had the pleasure this morning of watching a podcast you did earlier this week, which is a very interesting insight into the current Iranian issue in relation to nuclear negotiations around North Korea, from your own experience as part of that. So without further ado, I'd like us to give the warmest of welcomes. Michael is going to talk about the geopolitics of Tibet in his keynote speech for us today. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Julia. And can you hear me okay? Thank you, Tsering, for inviting me. I hear a bunch of voice, and I can't see you, but I won't let that stop me, and I'll look forward to your questions and insights. I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia. I moved here 3 years ago from Georgetown and CSIS. Julia asked, how did I convince Georgetown to let me stay so long? I think they forgot I'm here. And that's okay, because Australia, although it is far away from a lot of things, is still close enough for me to get up to Japan and Korea regularly, over to India and Southeast Asia. And it has been very, very interesting. The US Studies Centre that I run here is one of Australia's big four think tanks. The name is US, but in fact we do quite a bit of work on the geopolitics, economics of the Indo-Pacific, always touching on how the US and Australia work together, but we cut across a lot of areas. We have not done work on Tibet yet, and I think after this lecture I will go back to my staff and order them to think of a project we can do on Tibet together. Like Julia, my original expertise is in Japan. I then learned Korean, so I'm really a Northeast Asianist by training, and sort of spread out from there, and became a scholar and policy practitioner on the geopolitics, diplomacy, trade, defense of the Indo-Pacific writ large. When I was in the White House as special assistant to the president and senior director for Asia, my geographic remit went from the Duran line, from the sort of Afghanistan-Pakistan border, all the way to Hawaii, including, of course, Tibet. So I had not studied much about Tibet. I was always fascinated by His Holiness and read some of his publications. But I found myself right in the middle of the Tibet issue during the 4.5 years I was working in the White House at the NSC. His Holiness had quite a close relationship with President George W. Bush, as he did with Bill Clinton before that. My job as Senior Director for Asia was to manage that relationship. And it was a very, very warm relationship. because His Holiness did not represent a state under international diplomatic practice, or at least as the US and most countries pursue it, the Chinese side insisted that His Holiness not come to Washington, and then insisted that he not be given an audience with President Bush in the Oval Office, where the president's desk is, the Resolute desk, and where the president meets, and President Bush met the Prime Minister of Japan, Australia, and of course, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and later Xi Jinping. So the Chinese side insisted that not happen. So instead, when His Holiness came to Washington, he met with President Bush in the residence of the White House. And what Beijing failed to understand was that was a far more intimate, personal, and special setting for Americans and for the president. And in his meetings with His Holiness, President Bush had wide-ranging discussions. He talked about geopolitics. He talked about religious freedom. They talked quite a bit about China. I had, in 2004, been encouraging President Bush to go to Mongolia. No president had ever been to Mongolia. My boss, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, thought there was no way President Bush would go to Mongolia, but he was intrigued when I raised it with him. And so when he met with His Holiness the next time, he asked him what His Holiness thought. He said, "Green wants me to go to Mongolia. What do you think?" And His Holiness says, "Oh, Mr. President, you must go to Mongolia." And he said that in Mongolia, my brothers and sisters are even more committed Buddhists than my brothers and sisters in Tibet sometimes. And it's a wonderful place with so much spirituality and so much energy. And so President Bush, based on that, went to Mongolia, the first and only US president to do so. And they talked about how to make progress for the people of Tibet, and for the cause that Tibet represents. President Bush raised Tibet in almost every meeting he had with Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao. And the whole point was to raise it and not let it slip off the agenda. And it was not easy. As many of you would know, Hu Jintao had been senior party official in the Tibet Autonomous Region. Reportedly, he suffered from altitude sickness and was miserable the whole time he was in Lhasa. He was there, I believe I'm correct when I say he was there during the Tiananmen incident, and wrote a letter to Li Peng congratulating him, reportedly. So it was not meant to be a Chinese leader who looked to Tibet with any kind of benevolence, but he did listen to President Bush. He heard him out. Jiang Zemin did the same. President Bush often talked to Jiang Zemin about the importance of spirituality and of something greater than socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the market, or business. And the president said to Jiang Zemin in summits, the people of China will want more in their lives. Jiang Zemin actually studied the Bible before the next meeting with President Bush, and told him he didn't believe it, but he, being an engineer from Shanghai, took a scientific approach. But at some level, the president of the United States was able to talk about Tibet in ways where the Chinese leaders did not just condemn His Holiness or shut down the discussion. And that was an important thing for His Holiness, and an important thing for the people of Tibet. And when I left the White House in 2006, I continued to try to help how I could. Lodi Gary, who many of you know, became a very dear friend. He was incredibly well respected and loved by Republicans and Democrats. His memorial service on Capitol Hill had everyone from the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to former ambassadors to China, and it was very, very moving. And Lodi brought me in to try to help strategize as he sought to negotiate within the context of the Chinese constitution greater autonomy for Tibet, greater opportunity for the people of Greater Tibet to cherish, preserve their culture, and explore and expand and find meaning in their spiritual traditions. So I'm not a Tibet expert. I'm a Japan expert and a Broad Asia expert, but I was always fascinated by Tibet, as was my boss, President Bush. So it's from that context I want to say a few words to you for your conference about the geopolitics around the Tibet issue. It's something I have written a little bit about. I've done podcasts. I've hosted speakers at CSIS to try to put, mainly for Americans, but also for European, Japanese, Australian, Korean allies, to try to put the Tibet question in a geopolitical context, which is one of the many reasons why it matters so much. Tibet, as many of you know, has historically been a key linchpin in the geopolitics of Asia. Most of us who study the international relations and history of Asia, when we talk about pivotal contested spaces, tend to focus on the Korean Peninsula, the shrimp among whales, surrounded by a powerful China, Japan, Russia. But far in the Himalayan mountains from Korea, the future of Tibet was of great consequence to major powers throughout much of modern history. I wrote in one of my books about Mackinder and Mahan, who many of you have studied or teach, I'm sure. And Mackinder argued that whoever controls the hinterland will have the hegemonic position in world affairs. In contrast, Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval officer and strategist, wrote, whoever controls the maritime domain will be the great power. But the reality is that maritime powers had great interests in Tibet, even if it was not well understood by historians, because Tibet was so important to the future of geopolitics, not only in the Himalayan plateau, but well beyond. Many of you will have studied, written about, or taught the history of the Young Husband expedition in 1903, a British expedition to shape the future of Tibet at a time when geopolitical competition with Russia was heating up, when Britain in the maritime domain had just signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance to try to restore a balance of power vis-a-vis a rising Russia, where the British strategy involved reconciliation with America, which, of course, in the 19th century had often been a potential adversary of Great Britain. But Tibet was a key part of that chessboard. Japan, again, as many of you will know, also eyed Tibet as a maritime power, as a key part of the chessboard in its competition for influence vis-a-vis Russia and, of course, China. The Tibetan flag, historians write, was inspired by the Japanese Buddhist monk and spy, Bunchoku Aoki, who traveled to Tibet in 1911. I suspect that many of you have not been to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, but when you go in the less secret part of it, in the foyer, there's a large marble wall with brass stars for all of the CIA agents who've fallen in the line of duty. And they're all secret. They don't say who their names are, but they do reveal who the first one was. And the first CIA agent killed in, I think, 1947 or 48, was killed in Tibet with a jeep full of gold and supplies to try to encourage Tibetan resistance. So even for the maritime powers, Tibet has had consequential geopolitical significance. And of course it has for continental powers, first and foremost China, but also India. So today, once again, although it's not getting the attention it deserves, Tibet is the forgotten linchpin of the geopolitics of Asia, or at least one of the linchpins. And your conference is timely, of course, because His Holiness reportedly will tell us more in a week or so about the next Dalai Lama. Very likely, of course, that the next Dalai Lama will not be from China, just as Beijing, through its own somewhat perverse legislation, has declared that the party will decide who the Dalai Lama is. And of course, goes without saying, the next Dalai Lama will be within China and under China's control. So as all of that drama is unfolding, the backdrop is who will shape the geopolitics of the Himalayan region, and critically, the future of Greater Tibet. There are three ways in which the future of Tibet touches on the geopolitics in a much more fractured and contested international environment. Military infrastructure, water, and ideational competition, the competition of ideas. Military infrastructure. Tibet is and has long been critical to China's military infrastructure along its southern frontier, particularly vis-a-vis its historic rival in that part of the world, India. The PLA has built extensive bases, the People's Liberation Army, in Lhasa and up to the line of actual control, to include high-altitude railways, energy transmission systems, the deployment of missile systems. Tibet is a launch pad for PLA force projection towards India and control over contested states between India and China, like Nepal, and influence over Pakistan and beyond. This is a strategic problem of importance to maritime powers like the United States, Japan, Australia, and of course, India. The PLA's ability to horizontally escalate against India in any crisis constrains the Indian ability to project power in the maritime domain, and to do something that US and Australian and Japanese strategists have wanted now for 20 years, which is for India to essentially sanitize the Indian Ocean. And I've written 2 articles, one recently in the Washington Quarterly about Indian Ocean strategy. But from a US perspective, and my co-authors were Australian, so I think from an Australian and Japanese perspective as well, the Indian Ocean is a source of power projection, a way to transit American military power from CENTCOM for the Middle East to Indo-PACOM in a crisis, an area for defense in depth. And the US, Australia, Japan, members of the Quad, need India to be able to sanitize the Indian Ocean, to ensure the Indian Ocean is not used against any of the maritime partners in the Quad by China in a crisis. That's where the Himalayan plateau comes in. The infrastructure, the missile defense systems, the power projection at altitude above the Indian forces that Tibet presents for China allows horizontal escalation against India, allows China with relatively less effort to put Indian forces at greater risk and constrain India's ability to sanitize the Indian Ocean. So it has geopolitical importance that goes well beyond the Himalayan mountains, well into the maritime domain. The competition for influence and control in that part of the world is also intense and depends on China's position in Tibet. Nepal comes to mind first and foremost. When I was in the White House, the coup happened within the royal household in Kathmandu, and Beijing rushed in to try to curry favor with the government that came in the wake of the violent coup in 2005. And something quite remarkable happened. For the first time, the Indian National Security Advisor requested regular trilateral secure communications with his UK and American counterpart. India invited Britain and America in to help manage China's designs on Nepal. Non-alignment, of course, still a very powerful part of Indian strategic autonomy, but the government in New Delhi recognized that this could not be handled alone. And in fact, shortly after that, when I traveled to Kathmandu, I saw how Chinese influence had reduced the ability of people to get out of Tibet through Nepal to a trickle, to almost nothing. So Nepal is in play. And of course, China has broader influence over the Maldives, Sri Lanka, through the Belt and Road Initiative, the so-called String of Pearls. But those are all connected in the greater Chinese strategy to the Tibetan Plateau and to the military and infrastructure advantages China hopes to sustain there. Water. When I taught the international relations of Asia, I would ask my students, Julia, feel free to steal this idea. I would ask my students to break into groups and to prepare an argument about what non-traditional security issue, not the North Korean nuclear issue, not the Taiwan problem, not the South China Sea or India-Pakistan, what non-traditional security issue worried them the most, and then they had to do a simulated briefing to the U.S. commander of the Indo-Pacific Command about why that issue, that non-traditional security issue, deserved more attention. And most years, the group that won pointed to water, and particularly water shortages and the struggle for control of water sources for Asia's great rivers, the Brahmaputra, Mekong, and Yangtze and Indus, all of which are critical to downstream nations, not just India, but Bangladesh and even Vietnam. Beijing is seeking, through its dam building spree, to have strategic influence over the entire region based on control of water. Tibet's hydrological position is therefore quite critical. The third one I mentioned is ideational competition. The competition for supremacy of ideas. This is an old and important part of geopolitics. When I was a high school kid, I used to play a lot of board games. I think a lot of us in this business probably played Risk and diplomacy and other games when we were in our teen years, when we probably should have been doing something more fun and wild. But my friends and I in Bethesda Chevy Chase High School in Maryland used to play a board game called A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, and it was a board game about the Reformation. And on this big map of Europe, you had different pieces. You could be the Habsburg Empire. You could be King Henry VIII. You could be the French, the Ottoman Empire. And then there would be, and each of these countries, by the way, would have multiple pieces, navies, gold, armies. And then some players just had one piece. And on that piece was the name Martin Luther or some other Reformation leader. And if that player rolled the dice right, they could convert an entire country to Protestantism and win the game. And I was about 16. I was clearly a nerdy kid. And that just stuck with me, that geopolitics is not just about armies and infrastructure and investments and trade agreements. Defining the human spirit is frequently a key part of geopolitical competition, and it is again today. When Beijing talks about common destiny, to me as a Japan scholar, it sounds an awful lot like Japan's Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. The idea that Asian values are different, and that universal values, including religious freedom and human rights and women's empowerment, that universal values are not universal at all. They're Western and don't apply in Asia. That's also what's behind China's civilizational initiative. and also why Beijing is so incredibly sensitive to Tibet's example for free people around the world and for people who seek spiritual meaning. When I left the White House, one of the things I told Lodi Gary and others at the ICT was, His Holiness has incredible support among intellectuals and religious leaders, but his message is not understood by the typical think tank, State Department, international relations realists, or even the liberal institutionalists who study international law. His Holiness sends a message that seems to many of those people detached from the geopolitical realities they deal with. So we convinced His Holiness on his next trip to Washington, after that discussion, which was in 2012, to actually give a talk to the policy community. And Jeff Bader, who some of you may know, who was at Brookings at the time, who was President Obama's Asia advisor, who was very committed to the Tibetan cause. Jeff and I set up, between CSIS and the Brookings Institution and the Asia Society, a speech by His Holiness and a dialogue. And there were many wonderful moments in that discourse, in that back and forth. I think it's still on the CSIS website. But the part that stuck with me, which pertains to this issue of ideational competition and the Chinese Communist Party's deep insecurity about this spiritual question, is His Holiness told a story, which some of you have probably heard. And he told the story about how Li Peng, the premier of China during the Tiananmen crackdown, had a driver. And the driver published a memoir, I think in Hong Kong, illicitly, of course, not with the support of the Chinese Communist Party. And in it, Li Peng's driver confessed that in his later years, he must have been well into his late 80s, early 90s, Li Peng, the premier who oversaw the crackdown in Tiananmen, Li Peng converted to Tibetan Buddhism. And His Holiness paused for a minute and said, when you're 90, socialism with Chinese social, sorry, when you're 90, socialism with Chinese characteristics, not so useful anymore. And the audience laughed, but he made the point that there are many, many people within China, or were at that point, and presumably are still, who followed His Holiness, who believe deeply and religiously in Tibetan Buddhism, in Inner Mongolia, in Sichuan, and of course in the TAR and beyond. We also hosted at CSIS Lusang Sangye in 2019. He gave a speech that was really quite compelling. And he argued that for His Holiness, democracy was crucial to Tibet's identity. And I believe that's why His Holiness stepped down to make way for an elected leader in Dharamsala. Lusang made the point that this was important, even though it had some risk for His Holiness's own standing politically in the world. But it was a wise move because China fears democracy. And Tibet is a compassionate brother for Uyghurs, for Hong Kong, for Taiwan, and the rest of the free world. And that is a very powerful thing that is not material, it's ideational. And ideas matter in international relations and in geopolitical competition. So China's global civilizational initiative and attacks on universal values and the West depend on decrediting or discrediting or devaluing what His Holiness and the aspirations of the people of Tibet really represent. So it's important. Let me turn briefly to how the rest of the democratic world is now responding to the Tibet challenge as Beijing pushes laws to exert control over the future of Tibet, not just within China's borders, but over the spiritual self-determination of the Tibetan people. The picture is very mixed and not great, to be honest. Geopolitical fracturing has fractured the support for Tibet in some ways. India holds a unique card, supports the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamsala. And India, as a country and as a people, are, I think, committed. And India, of course, has intense concerns about Chinese designs on the Himalayan region, but of course also the Indian Ocean and the so-called String of Pearls. And senior Indian officials and scholars understand full well everything I said until now. The challenge, I think, for Delhi is that it also seeks economic development. It seeks to retain strategic autonomy. And it needs, for various reasons, a stabilization in relations with Beijing since the bloody melee at Daklan. So India is critical, but is somewhat limited in the lengths to which it can go. The US has been critical in a very different way. Every president of the United States, from George Herbert Walker Bush through George W. Bush, to include Clinton, of course, met with His Holiness when he came to Washington, and gave him more time than they would give many heads of state from major countries, and took on the Tibetan cause in their discussions with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And that was true for Barack Obama too. Although President Obama, as many of you know, chose not to meet with His Holiness on his first trip, but instead to meet first with Hu Jintao in November 2009 to try to establish strategic reassurance with China. I actually, together with Rich Armitage, who recently passed away, who was very supportive of Tibet, who was the Deputy Secretary of State during Bush and was in the Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush administrations. Rich and I met with His Holiness for breakfast in Washington after President Obama declined to see him. His Holiness was sanguine, didn't mind, understood. The staff was more worried. Eventually, President Obama did see him and was supportive. I worked for John McCain, who would have been supportive as well in 2008. President Trump is cut from different cloth. Goes without saying, President Trump does not have a deep interest in issues of social justice or morality or spirituality. In the first Trump administration, the Tibet issue was championed, but often by hawks who were using it as a point of attack on China rather than as a cause worth supporting because of the universal values inherent in that struggle as well. The second Trump administration is even less wedded to strategic coordinates. There's more internal division and chaos. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, though, who I've talked to about Tibet before he became secretary, I think is at the end of the day a strong champion of freedom. Obviously, the child of Cuban emigres, anti-communist, but I think sincerely committed to freedom and democracy, but not able to do much about it right now, given the internal struggles, shall we say, of the Trump administration. Meanwhile, in practical terms, support for Tibet is really being gutted right now in the US, and it's a bit heartbreaking. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, has gutted the US Agency for International Development, including critical support for Tibet, has attempted to do away with, so far unsuccessfully, the National Endowment for Democracy, has attempted to do away with Radio Free Asia. I'm on the board of Radio Free Asia. As some of you probably know, for 30 years, Radio Free Asia has been broadcasting into Tibet with its Tibetan news service, breaking amazing stories the world would not know about. For example, the efforts by China to depopulate areas to build dams and so forth, Sadly, the Trump administration cut funding for Radio Free Asia's transmissions, and Beijing swooped in and bought those frequencies and is now putting out state propaganda against His Holiness and against the US. So this is a complete onside goal by the US. I personally think it's a temporary setback. I've done quite a bit of public opinion polling in this area, and Derek Mitchell, former head of National Democratic Institute, and I did a report for CSIS about 6 months ago that cites, among other things, polls that show that 85% of Americans believe that strengthening support for democracy and human rights abroad is important or very important for American interests. So we're in a bad patch in the US, but it will directly and negatively affect Tibet's position. Japan is interesting. I heard that someone earlier said Japan has other fish to fry, which was a good phrase, seeing as most Japanese like sushi. But it is true that Japan is extremely careful not to change the fundamentals of its China policy since normalization. But beneath the surface, I've detected quite a bit of change within Japan. I was pretty close to Shinzo Abe. He was my counterpart when I was in the White House. I frequently met with him or telephoned him, and then saw him when he was out of power and then as prime minister subsequent to that. When he was prime minister in 2007, His Holiness went to Japan, and I met with Abe, and Abe pledged support, security for His Holiness, and so forth. And so in small ways, Japan has really changed. And I think the Japanese political leadership has taken an interest in Tibet. In 2022, the Japanese Diet passed a resolution on human rights in China with specific mention of Tibet. Prime Minister Kishida assigned the current defense minister, Nakatani Gen, as Japan's first human rights envoy. And if you haven't met her, one of the most amazing political figures in Japan today is Arifia Eri, a Uyghur Japanese who is in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and is was served as parliamentary vice minister of foreign affairs, championing the causes of Xinjiang and Tibet. She also happened to be my student at Georgetown. So under the surface, Japan's moving in the right direction, but as one of your speakers would have said earlier, not ready for big moves on the chessboard. Australian Foreign Ministry, DFAT, is extremely cautious on Tibet and extremely cautious on China policy, no doubt about it. The current Albanese government is seeking stabilization of relations with China, standing by the alliance with the US, the Quad with Japan, Australia, India, and the US, but very careful on sensitive issues to China like Tibet. But the interesting thing about Australians is they like to give people a fair go. And they're practical people. And in surveys I've done in my center here, when we ask Americans and Australians, the public, how important human rights are, Australians say they're important by a significantly higher margin than Americans even. So again, I think within Australia, there is a pool of support potentially there. The problem is, as China and together with Russia, and in some ways with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and in the so-called CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis, we can spend time debating how cohesive that actually is. But the reality is there is more alignment among these, the axis of disruption or the axis of authoritarianism. But more importantly, the Chinese pressure on the Indian Ocean, on the South China Sea, on Japan, on Taiwan, all of this is pushing countries apart rather than together on the Tibet issue. And I think, therefore, in the coming months and years, as Tibet hits a crucial crossroads, a new chapter, it will be really important for people in that room right now. I can't see you, but I know who you are. For people like me, or Derek Mitchell, or Dan Twining, Senator Dan Sullivan, former President George Bush and Bill Clinton, it will be really important for those stakeholders to articulate what is at stake. The geopolitics of the Tibetan plateau, the breadth of support within not just the Tibet Autonomous Region, but across China and into Mongolia and beyond for the message of His Holiness, the extent of the cultural, climate, and spiritual destruction occurring, and the link to religious freedom everywhere. These are points that will resonate with average Americans and Australians, with French and British citizens. But I think all of us who have a voice need to find a way to articulate it so everyone knows what is at stake. Well, I am done. I can't see you. For all I know, you're all asleep right now. But I hope that was useful, and Julie, I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you, Michael. I can assure you that all eyes are open and everybody's smiling, seems very happy. Shall we take some questions from the audience? Would anybody, I can hand it over. Would you mind please introducing yourself, because obviously Michael can't see you. Thank you.
Charlie Parton, who spoke earlier, I have a very quick question. Do you think that CSIS and Brookings, etc., would organise a similar conference today as it did the one you mentioned?
That's a very interesting question. I do. And without sharing too much dirty laundry, Jeff Bader at Brookings and I were absolutely committed to doing it. But we had to convince the leadership and the board of both organizations that it was okay. That's how sensitive some of the foreign policy leadership in Washington was. And this was 2012. So it was really as Xi Jinping was coming to power, and really before Americans, but I think also Europeans and many others, came to understand what was happening in China's relationship with the world. In 2012, for example, the Chicago Council for Global Affairs, which does really interesting polling of the American public, asked the question, is America's future in Asia more dependent on China or on Japan and traditional democratic allies? And a plurality chose Japan and allies, but only a very narrow plurality over China. And within the think tank community and the Obama administration, there was something of a split on that question. In polls more recently, 85 or 90% of Americans say it's our allies. David Shambaugh at George Washington, who I just hosted here in Sydney before this, has a book out about U.S.-China relations where he cites polls that show, the number of Americans who think China's our partner are in the single digit, 4 or 5%. So the political sensitivity is not what it was in 2012. But to be candid, the Washington foreign policy establishment, the swamp, the blob, is really on its heels. It's really in a bit of disarray because of the Trump shock, the defunding of think tanks, the defunding of democracy supporting organizations. So it might not occur to them to do it, but the politics of it, I think, would be possible. If it's about China, frankly, anything can be done these days. So I think it's a really good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Michael Green. This is Dileep Sinha. I'm from India. In the Resolve Tibet Act, there is a provision, as was there earlier also, that any Chinese official involved in the selection process of the Dalai Lama will face sanctions. How likely is the US government to follow this act in case this eventuality were to occur?
As a general point, President Trump clearly feels less required to implement legislation than any of his predecessors going back probably 100 years. So the question is, who within the Trump administration would believe that this is an important thing to do? And here I'm going to do a little bit of Kremlin watching or Pekinology based on what we know about the Trump administration. As I said, Secretary of State Rubio, I think, is in the right place on these issues. the former National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, was also quite outspoken critic of China and human rights when he was in the House of Representatives. But he did not last long. He's now waiting to be confirmed as ambassador to the UN. Rubio is serving concurrently as the National Security Advisor. But the NSC staff, which typically has, in recent administrations, 250 to 400 people on it, is down to less than 100. It's been really denuded. So enacting or acting on that kind of legislation and making sure it's done often falls to the National Security Council. And that would be the Asia Senior Director, the job I had, and the Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights. That latter post does not exist. There's nobody pushing it from the human rights perspective. The Asia Senior Director is a very capable guy named Ivan Kapanathi. He's a former Marine. He served in different roles in Taiwan. He was one of the key China experts in the first Trump administration. It's not clear to me he has the staff or the bandwidth to follow up on something like that. We have sorry for the criminology, I'll wrap it up, but we are waiting in the State Department to see who comes in key positions. And there are some possibilities there who might champion this. The Undersecretary for Political Affairs nominee is a woman, Allison Hooker, who was on the Radio Free Asia board with me and served in the first Trump White House as NSC expert on Korea and Japan. She's someone who would automatically understand what I've just said to you and the importance of Tibet. The Assistant Secretary for East Asia is a former businessman and a lawyer named Michael Desambre. Not his background. He was ambassador in Thailand in the first Trump administration. He might, but there are others. So what I should say as a short answer to your question is, legally, it should be implemented. Sometimes administrations sort of slow walk these kinds of things. With the Trump administration, it could be completely ignored. President Trump himself might dislike it if it gets in the way of something he wants to do with China. But you may well find someone in the administration who's willing to take this torch and carry it forward. That, by the way, is why Lodi Gyari was such a secret weapon for His Holiness, because he was just brilliant at finding people like me in administrations who would take on this cause. So I wouldn't give up hope, despite the chaos and some of the backsliding in the Trump administration.
Hi, this is Carol McGranahan, and I'm not an IR person or think tank scholar, but anthropologist, historian, and Lodi, Gyari Rinpoche, was my mentor. So I worked for him at ICT for 2 years. He's the one who sent me off to graduate school, taught me a lot, but set me on a specific path. And the question I have for you is historical. So I'm thinking back to 1947 and England kicked out of India. India emerges as an independent country, and what happens is that England basically stops supporting Tibet diplomatically, says that's now the job of India, right? And the Tibetans take this really hard, right? Because they have relationships that they have built up that aren't necessarily with India, but with the British. And so I'm wondering if we might be in a parallel situation now, where all of a sudden the country in the world, or countries, maybe not the empire, right? But the polity, the political entity in the world that was most connected to Tibet other than China, no longer was taking on that role. And so in its space, right, stepped into the United States. So in that vacuum. And the US has been in that role now for a very long time. If we are now in a moment in this second Trump administration where US support for Tibet publicly and privately is now, by all intents and purposes, seems to be eviscerated, who do you think might step into this role? Where are you? What might your crystal ball look like in terms of who or what entity, group of polities might be the ones who step in to advocate for Tibet and be there?
Thank you, Carol. And you're probably like me and my wife. We miss Modi almost every day. We have a beautiful tanka hanging in our hallway here that Lodi and his family gave us. And I assume you've read his memoir, his book, The Envoy, and I was really touched and honored and a bit intimidated when I was asked to write the foreword to that book. And I hope I did him justice in it. It's a really interesting question, and I had not thought of it that way before. And hurry up and publish that thought, because otherwise I will steal it. We are at a moment of shifting tectonic plates and geopolitics and realignment of world politics, not unlike that period of British decolonization and the end of the British Empire and the rise of the sort of Pax Americana. We are at a similar, it's not the same, but we're at a moment that is similar in that the geopolitical underpinnings are shifting in ways that will not return to what it was. So I'm going to get a little bit international relations theory on you in answering by saying one of the big debates about grand strategy in Asia at a time of Chinese power and revisionism, seeking to change the order. One of the big debates has been, is this a bipolar region? And is this a bipolar issue? And a question where the two great powers, the United States and China, have to either fight or compromise or settle this. That was the premise of the Thucydides trap by Graham Allison, which argued that, like Athens and Sparta, China and the US are destined for war. Xi Jinping loved that book, was very structural and Marxist. And the implication was, well, to avoid a war, the US has to back down in this two-player game, this bipolar game of China and the US. And in 2008, Jeff Bader and I wrote a competing strategies, and Jeff made the argument that the China problem has to be solved primarily between the US and China. My argument was, and you'd expect this from a Japan and Korea expert, that the China problem has to be stabilized both through deterrence and diplomacy, by recognizing that this is not primarily a bipolar game, and this is not primarily a bipolar region. It is a multipolar region that India, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, Korea, all have agency, and none of them want Chinese hegemony. And they all have different relationships with the United States, some close treaty allies like Australia, others like India, more of an alignment than an alliance. But that multipolarity, that ability to harness by recognizing that Asia is not just a US-China game, is to our advantage. It multiplies our influence. It reinforces our argument that democracy is not a European or Eurocentric or Anglo-American idea. It's an Indian idea, a Japanese idea, and a Korean idea. The maritime power of the Quad countries. I was in the White House when the tsunami happened and was involved in setting up the Quad in 2005. So that was another view, multipolar. I think the Tibet question, maybe we should be thinking about in the same way. The US relative power and perhaps commitment is not what it was. Maybe we need to think about a multipolar approach. The challenge, of course, as I just described, is that Japan, India, Australia all have limits to how much risk they are willing to take in support of Tibet. The US is big enough, strong enough, important enough to be able to absorb that risk, to take that risk. So there's a limit to collective action in that sense. But that's also true of defense, diplomacy, secure supply chains, critical minerals. There's a collective action problem on all of the multipolar things we're trying to do. And I don't have a good answer for you, Carol, but I do think that the answer lies in multipolarity, in championing those people in India, Japan, Australia, Korea, which I can talk about if you like, who believe this matters. I also think it's partly about buying time, because every American will have you sound American, and you are, I guess. Every American will have a different view of this. My view, as someone who's written a lot of history of American engagement in Asia, is that this is a tornado, it's not climate change. That the Trump effect is not permanent. And the question is, how do we rebuild? How do we maintain? And that's where perhaps multipolarity with the limits of collective action might help us. Sorry for the very IR theory answer. The other quick answer would be philanthropy. I don't want to say who it is, since I think this is being live streamed, but a very prominent American business leader has for years quietly provided financial support for Tibet. And I think philanthropy is going to have to be another key part of this, given the hopefully temporary setback in funding for Tibet, for the NED, for IRI, for Radio Free Asia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. My name is Tenzin Dorje. And my question is about the tornado you just mentioned and about Taiwan as well. Since, it's true there has been a gutting of many different institutional types of support for Tibet right now in the United States, but because there is a tornado and so much norm breakdown right now that's been happening around human rights, at the same time, is it possible to think of the type of things or the type of new precedents that could be set only in a tornado? In what ways can we make use of this tornado right now before it settles down? And secondly, what do you think are the chances of a military conflict between US and China over Taiwan in the next 4 years?
I'm going to mix metaphors too much in this answer, but to build on the tornado metaphor, and by that I mean, of course, that the Doge defunding, the Trump effect is like a tornado, unpredictable, never sure when it will end, whether more will come, but it's not a permanent condition like climate change. That's what I was getting at. And so during this tornado period of clear destruction of institutions and capacity in the U.S. to support Tibet and human rights and democracy, how do we make lemons out of lemonade? How do we climb out of this? Honestly, this is not a great answer, but when you tell your kid, don't touch the stove, you'll burn your finger, and then they burn their finger, boy, do they learn how to handle a stove better. And I think the stories are coming out already. The New York Times in particular, David Sanger, have really spotlighted the consequences of American retreat in these areas. I mentioned just now the frequencies Radio Free Asia uses being grabbed by the Chinese for propaganda against the United States. So these are examples that should be collected and broadcast. They came up in the hearing of Carrie Lake, who is now I forget her title, but sort of the Rasputin of the board of the BGA, of the governing board for Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. These all came out in the testimony from members of Congress, or a lot of them did. The Congress under Republican control looks supine, looks weak, looks afraid of President Trump. I don't think that's a permanent condition. Many of these members of Congress, particularly in the Senate, are like Marco Rubio. They believe in, their hero is Ronald Reagan, not Donald Trump. They need Donald Trump to stay in office, but their hero is Ronald Reagan, and Reagan's Windsor speech and championing of democracy and human rights on the Republican side. They're there, and the coalition is there in the Congress if you want to build it. On the Democratic side, Ami Bera and others who take a deep interest in Asia, Senator Coons from Delaware, Van Hollen from Maryland. I did a monthly strategy dinner in Washington with 10 members of the Senate and a small group of think tank experts and administration officials, where we would brainstorm over dinner on China strategy. And it was all off the record, and it was before I moved to Australia. But these were senators who were interested in the China challenge. But they were pretty unified on the importance of the human rights and democracy as part of this challenge. So I think the coalition is there to be built, and maybe I don't know, maybe the sort of regularity of congressional funding for some of these important democracy institutions being interrupted is an excuse to really supercharge again congressional interest. China, I worked in the Pentagon in the late 90s when we said that China-Taiwan situation is the most dangerous it's been since the 1950s. Well, it's now the most dangerous it's been since the 1990s, more dangerous. The PLA is conducting military exercises regularly around Taiwan, on two sides of Taiwan, in close, air, naval, cyber, drones, submarines, simulating blockade, potentially invasion, so massive that it is going to be difficult for analysts to assess whether this is a exercise or an actual invasion. And it's happening with greater frequency, and it's being combined with military exercises by the PLA Navy between Japan and Guam, in the South China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and even around Australia. In February, a Chinese task force with missile cruisers circumnavigated Australia, did live fire exercises between Australia and New Zealand. So very aggressive posture by the PLA, designed to intimidate everyone, designed to push Australia back, to intimidate Japan, to push India back. But at the end of the day, and that's very dangerous. And the order of battle, the balance of military power is shifting steadily in China's direction. However, at the end of the day, a Chinese use of force, an attack on Taiwan, is an existentially risky roll of the dice. The US still has a significant lead over China in submarines and undersea warfare, and we have a network of alliances China doesn't have. And we have the ability in a crisis to cut off sea lanes to China, and China relies on those sea lanes for half of its energy sources. So I'm still convinced that Xi Jinping can be deterred, is deterred, and seeks to win without fighting. You know, I tell my students the worst thing you can do as an Asia scholar is to quote Sun Tzu, and then I find myself constantly quoting Sun Tzu, to win without fighting. But it's true. Xi wants to win without fighting by just intimidating massively. Could that turn into a war? Yes, more easily than anything we've seen in many, many decades. But at the end of the day, my view is it's too risky, and he's deterred, and he would know the vulnerabilities from the US Navy and Air Force, the US nuclear arsenal, and within the PLA. Within the PLA, he has had to sack the head of his strategic rocket forces, his defense minister. There is still corruption and inefficiency, and even whatever you think of the bombing of Iran recently, that was a highly complex, multi-domain precision strike on the opposite side of the world. The PLA can't do that, so they see the power of the American military still. So important question, long answer, apologies, but be nervous, but not too nervous.
This is Sonika from India. I'm an academic. In everything that you spoke, there is one thing which I'm wondering if you think will outlive as an interest of the US beyond the Trump administration, which is access to rare earth metals from China, and especially if there is mining in Tibet, and if there has been any discussion about this and how this issue plays into the US policy on Tibet.
It's a very good point. I have not heard. So the U.S. Studies Center, which I now lead in Australia, the first name of the center is U.S. because it was started 16 years ago, focused on U.S.-Australia relations. But we do geopolitics across the Indo-Pacific now. And as you can imagine, being in Australia, we do a lot of work on critical minerals and secure supply chains, because Australia produces a lot of those critical minerals, but they don't have the ability to process them. Over 90% is processed in China. And China is embargoing exports of critical minerals like germanium to try to punish the US for its export control. So everyone knows there's a vulnerability. And there's lots of discussion. I have not heard Tibet discussed. And I suspect it's because it can't solve the problem for obvious reasons. The US, Australia, Japan, NATO, India, we can't access those critical minerals. But it is an important point you make, because China will. And I don't know if we know how much there is, but probably considerable resources. And critical minerals mining, one of the reasons that the US doesn't do it, or Canada, or even Australia that much, Australia does, but there are limits, is because of the environmental damage and the huge amount of water it takes. And so the US in particular has refrained from extensive mining of critical minerals or processing because of all those environmental and water reasons. That's not going to stop China. And so it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but it's a research topic worth looking at, I think. What would it look like if China pursued critical minerals in the Tibet Autonomous Region, Greater Tibet, the way they've pursued damming of rivers, without any real concern about temples, history, culture, people's livelihood, or the environment? It could be, one of the next big things we're talking about. You have inspired me to watch that space.
Thank you so much, Michael. You've taken us around the world, into Langley headquarters, through a personal and international relations approach, and you focused on Tibet the whole way through. And I think, judging from the nods in this room and from the variety of questions, I think you can hear that your presentation has been deeply appreciated.
Thank you very, very much. If you come to Australia, please look us up. I think our researchers would be really interested in hearing your expertise, and Australia does have a role in this.
Hi, Mike. This is Tsering again, the organizer of the conference. I had my own question about how the Tibetans should navigate a future scenario, unlikely but not impossible, of a clash between the US and China, or China and India, based on historical precedents, because there are Tibetans in the US Army, Tibetans in the PLA, Tibetans in the Indian Army. But I will, not ask that question, but I want to thank you personally for, accepting our invitation and delivering such an excellent keynote speech. And hopefully, in the near future, we can do this kind of event in person at some point.
Absolutely. I hear the beer is very good in Birmingham, so I will try to go next time. Thank you, Tsering. I really look forward to seeing the results of the conference.